Hi everyone, welcome to Talk Easy. Today in our studio, Catherine and Mike will be talking about explaining symptoms at the doctor's office.
All right, so have you ever walked into a doctor's office and completely blanked? Like you suddenly forget how to explain what's wrong.
Oh yeah, it's like stage fright, but for your health.
Exactly. And imagine if you're trying to do that in English when it's not your first language.
Oh, that adds a whole other layer of complexity for sure.
That's exactly what we're diving into today, how to communicate effectively with doctors in English.
Hmm.
We've got some great sources here that are specifically designed for English language learners.
Which is fantastic, but I think even native English speakers can pick up some useful tips.
Oh, absolutely. Because sometimes it's the simplest things like knowing the right words to describe your symptoms that can make all the difference.
I think that's a great point. So let's start with vocabulary, because having the right words is essential for clear communication.
Our sources break down common symptoms into categories like pain, general discomfort, cold and flu symptoms, things like that.
It's like having a toolbox filled with the right tools for the job.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
just reading through these lists, I realized there were some words I wasn't even using correctly.
One thing that really stood out to me was the emphasis on describing the intensity and duration of symptoms.
Oh, right. Like saying mild headache is very different from saying pounding headache that won't go away.
Exactly. Those details give the doctor a much clearer picture of what's going on.
It's like if you stub your toe, you might say it's a sharp pain, but it'll probably be over quickly.
Whereas a dull ache could linger for days.
And that's where understanding why doctors ask certain questions can help you communicate more effectively.
Absolutely. They're not just trying to make small talk. They're gathering clues to help them diagnose the problem.
So when they ask, when did the symptoms start, they're not just asking for a date on the calendar.
Right. They're trying to understand the timeline and progression of the issue.
So saying it started yesterday is less helpful than saying it started yesterday afternoon after I went for a run.
Exactly. That extra bit of information could be crucial.
It's like giving them a more detailed map of what's happening in your body. Our sources also list some other common questions like, have you taken any medication? Does anything make it better or worse? Have you had these symptoms before?
And what's interesting is that English-speaking doctors often expect very specific, detailed answers.
So it's not enough to just say yes or no.
Right. You need to provide context and be as specific as possible.
So if you've taken medication, be prepared to say what it was when you took it and whether it helped or not.
And if you've had similar symptoms before, be ready to describe when that was what happened and how it was treated.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. Details. Details.
Details. It's like painting a picture for the doctor. The more details you provide, the clearer the image becomes.
And the better they can understand what's going on.
Now remember, it's not just about speaking clearly. It's also about understanding what the doctor is saying back to you.
Oh, yeah, because it can be really intimidating when they start using all those medical terms you've never heard before.
It's like they're speaking a different language.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that's when it's perfectly okay and actually encouraged to ask for clarification.
You have the right to understand what's happening with your own body.
So it's not a sign of weakness to say, hold on, can you explain that in simpler terms?
Not at all. It shows you're engaged and want to be an active participant in your healthcare.
Our sources actually give some really helpful phrases like, can you explain that more simply? Or what should I do if it doesn't get better?
It's like a cheat sheet for communicating with your doctor.
I love that.
And one thing that really resonated with me was the emphasis on being an advocate for yourself.
I think a lot of people feel like they should just sit there and nod their head, but really it should be more of a partnership.
Exactly. The doctor brings their medical expertise, but you bring the expertise of your own body and your own experiences.
And the better we can communicate with each other, the better the outcome is likely to be.
It's a two-way street. The doctor needs information from you to make informed decisions, and you need clear explanations from the doctor to feel confident in your care.
Speaking of feeling confident, I think one of the things I struggle with most is knowing how to phrase questions so they sound well intelligent.
I think that's something a lot of people face. But here's the thing. Doctors don't expect you to be medical experts.
That's reassuring.
They want you to ask questions. It shows you're taking your health seriously.
So instead of nodding along pretending I understand, I should just be honest and say, I'm not sure I follow Bay. Can you rephrase that?
Exactly. And don't hesitate to ask clarifying questions even if they seem basic.
Like if the doctor says, take this medication twice a day, it's okay to ask, should I take it with food? Or what if I miss a dose?
Absolutely. Those seemingly small questions can make a big difference in how effective the treatment is.
And our sources have a great example dialogue where the patient asks about medication frequency and activities to avoid.
It's helpful to see those clarifying questions in action.
What I find interesting about that example is that it shows how assertive communication can actually lead to better care.
You're not just passively following instructions, you're actively involved in your treatment plan,
So it's not just about being able to speak English, it's about being able to communicate effectively.
which involves both speaking and listening, asking questions, and making sure you understand what's being said.
And those skills are valuable for anyone, regardless of their language background.
Absolutely. Now, thinking back to what we talked about earlier about doctors being like detectives gathering clues.
Right, they're trying to solve the mystery of what's going on.
Exactly. Asking questions is like giving them more pieces of the puzzle.
And the more complete the puzzle, the better they can understand the situation and find the best solution.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about emergencies.
Okay, because when every second counts clear, communication becomes even more critical.
Right. In those high-pressure situations, it's all about getting your message across quickly and effectively.
Our sources really emphasize the importance of being direct and concise in emergencies.
Forget about trying to be eloquent or using fancy vocabulary.
Just get straight to the point.
It's like sending a distress signal. You need to be clear and concise to ensure that help arrives quickly.
So instead of saying, I'm experiencing a rather intense discomfort in my chest area, you just say, severe chest pain.
Exactly. And instead of saying, I'm feeling rather lightheaded and unsteady on my feet, you'd simply say, I feel like I'm going to faint.
Those are the kinds of phrases that immediately grab attention and convey the urgency of the situation.
And our sources also highlight the importance of providing key details.
Like when the symptoms started, if you've taken any medication or if you have any allergies.
Every bit of information could be potentially life-saving.
Like giving the medical team a head start in figuring out how to help you. I remember reading a really compelling example in one of our sources.
Oh yeah, tell me about it.
It was about someone experiencing a sudden onset of chest pain, and they went straight to the point. Sharp chest pain, trouble breathing. It started about 15 minutes ago.
That's a perfect illustration of how clear, concise communication can save precious time.
It's like in those moments, your words become your lifeline.
And it's not just about what you say, but also how you say it.
How so?
Well, the sources point out that in many English-speaking cultures, there's a strong emphasis on speed and directness in emergency situations.
So no beating around the bush or using flowery language?
Just state the problem clearly and concisely.
Got it.
Yeah.
And I imagine staying calm is also really important in those situations.
Absolutely. Panic can cloud your thinking and make it harder to communicate effectively.
It's like that saying, keep your head when all about you are losing theirs.
Exactly. Now, stepping back from those intense situations for a moment,
Okay, let's take a breather.
let's consider all the tools we've gathered so far.
We've got vocabulary for describing symptoms, strategies for answering those rapid-fire doctor questions, and tips for seeking clarification when we need it.
It's like we've equipped ourselves to navigate doctor's visits in English with confidence and clarity.
But you know what I find truly empowering about all of this?
What's that?
It's the realization that we're not just learning language, we're learning how to advocate for our own health.
I love that perspective. It's about taking control of our well-being.
And that's true whether you're a native English speaker or someone who's still learning the language.
We all have the right to understand our health and make informed decisions.
And knowing what we know now, how might we approach our next doctor's visit differently?
That's a great question to ponder. Maybe it's something as simple as writing down our symptoms beforehand or practicing some key phrases.
Or maybe it's about being more assertive in asking for clarification or double-checking that we understand the doctor's instructions.
Whatever it is, I encourage everyone listening to take that step, because even a small change can make a big difference in our communication and ultimately in our health.
It's like building a bridge between what we're feeling and what the doctor needs to know to help us.
And language is the bridge that connects those two shores.
Speaking of bridges, let's talk about a different kind of bridge, the cultural bridge.
Ah, yes, that's an important one. How understanding cultural nuances can play a role in effective communication with doctors.
I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Well, our sources point out that in many English-speaking cultures, there's a strong emphasis on directness and efficiency in communication.
Especially in medical settings.
Exactly. It's about conveying information clearly and concisely without unnecessary embellishments or indirectness.
I can see how that could be a bit of a culture shock for people from cultures where communication is more nuanced or indirect.
Absolutely. And it's important to be aware of these differences so we don't accidentally send the wrong message.
For example, if someone is used to expressing pain or discomfort in a more understated way, They might need to adjust their communication style to make sure the doctor understands the severity of this situation.
Right. It's about finding that balance between being respectful of cultural norms and making sure our needs are met.
So it's not just about learning the language, it's also about learning the cultural context in which that language is used.
Precisely. And our sources offer some really helpful tips for navigating these cultural differences.
Like what?
Well, they suggest being upfront about any language barriers we might have and not being afraid to ask for clarification if we don't understand something.
That makes a lot of sense. It's better to ask than to risk a misunderstanding.
They also encourage patients to be assertive but respectful in expressing their needs and concerns.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between being direct and being polite.
Exactly. And they highlight the importance of active listening, paying attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues from the doctor.
Because sometimes it's not just about what they say, but how they say it.
Right. We want to be attuned to their tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language to get a full understanding of what they're communicating.
It's like being a cultural detective looking for clues to help us decode the message.
And speaking of decoding messages, let's talk about another important aspect of communicating with doctors understanding medical terminology.
Oh yeah, those long, complicated words can be really intimidating, especially when you're already feeling stressed or anxious.
But don't worry, our sources have some great tips for tackling those medical jargon hurdles.
All right, tell me their secrets for deciphering doctor speak.
Well, one of their top recommendations is to keep a medical glossary handy, either a physical book or an app on your phone.
That's a great idea. Having a quick reference guide can be a lifesaver.
They also suggest breaking down long words into smaller parts to try and figure out their meaning.
Like how electrocardiogram can be broken down into meaning electrical cardio, meaning heart, and gram, meaning recording.
Exactly. And sometimes just understanding the root of the word can give you a clue about its meaning.
Our sources also emphasize the importance of not being afraid to ask the doctor to explain any terms you don't understand.
Absolutely. There's no shame in admitting you need clarification. It shows that you're engaged and want to be an informed patient.
And remember, doctors are used to explaining things in simpler terms. They don't expect you to have a medical degree.
They want to make sure you understand what's going on and why certain tests or treatments are being recommended.
It's all about building that bridge of understanding between the medical world and the patient's experience.
And sometimes that bridge needs a little translation.
Which brings us to our next topic. What to do if you need an interpreter during a doctor's visit.
Ah, yes, that's a crucial aspect of ensuring clear communication for patients who don't speak English fluently.
And our sources provide some really valuable guidance on how to navigate those situations.
First and foremost, they emphasize the importance of requesting an interpreter in advance.
If possible, of course.
Yes. So the clinic or hospital can make the necessary arrangements.
It's definitely much smoother than trying to find an interpreter on the spot.
They also recommend confirming that the interpreter is qualified and experienced in medical interpreting.
Which makes sense because medical terminology can be very specific and nuanced.
We want to make sure the interpreter understands the subtleties of the language.
And they suggest preparing for the appointment by writing down key questions or concerns beforehand.
So you can make sure all your important points are covered.
And during the appointment, it's important to speak directly to the doctor, not to the interpreter.
Right. The interpreter is there to facilitate the conversation, but the focus should remain on the doctor-patient relationship.
That makes sense. It helps maintain that direct line of communication.
Our sources also highlight the importance of clarifying any cultural nuances that might affect communication.
Oh, that's interesting. Like what kind of nuances?
Well, for example, some cultures have different beliefs or practices around health and illness that the doctor might not be aware of.
It's about bridging that cultural gap to ensure everyone is on the same page.
And they encourage patients to ask for a summary of the conversation at the end.
To make sure they understand everything that was discussed.
Exactly. It's a good way to solidify the key takeaways and ensure that nothing gets lost in translation.
You know, it's amazing how much thought and effort goes into effective communication in healthcare.
It's like a delicate dance involving language, culture, and medical knowledge.
And when all the elements come together harmoniously, it can lead to really positive health outcomes. So let's recap all the wisdom we've gleaned from our sources today.
Sounds good.
We've learned about the importance of clear and concise communication, being assertive in asking questions, and understanding medical terminology.
We've explored strategies for navigating cultural differences and the role of interpreters in facilitating communication.
And we've discovered the power of active listening and being an engaged participant in our healthcare journeys.
It's like we've assembled a toolkit for communicating effectively with doctors in English.
And these tools aren't just for English language learners. They're valuable for anyone who wants to improve their healthcare communication skills.
Absolutely. Because clear communication is a universal language that transcends cultural and linguistic boundaries.
It's a language that can empower us to take control of our health and advocate for our well-being. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Okay, I'm listening.
Think about your next doctor's visit. What's one small change you can make to ensure clearer, more confident communication?
That's a powerful question to reflect on. It could be as simple as writing down your symptoms beforehand or practicing a few key phrases.
Or maybe it's about being more mindful of our tone of voice, or making eye contact with the doctor.
Whatever that small change is, I encourage everyone listening to embrace it. Because even the smallest step can lead to a significant improvement in our communication and ultimately in our health.
And remember, clear communication isn't a destination, it's a journey.
It's a skill we can continually develop and refine throughout our lives.
So keep practicing, keep learning, and keep using your voice to advocate for your well-being.
Because when you communicate clearly, you unlock the power to take control of your health and create a brighter future for yourself. It's like we were saying before about understanding what the doctor's saying back to us.
Yeah, those medical terms can be really confusing.
Exactly. And that's where it's so important to ask for clarification.
So it's okay to just say, wait, I don't understand. Can you explain that again?
Absolutely. You have a right to understand what's happening with your own health.
It's like our sources were saying we shouldn't be afraid to advocate for ourselves,
I think sometimes people feel intimidated by doctors.
right? Like, I don't want to seem rude or question their expertise.
But really, it should be a collaboration.
The doctor has the medical knowledge, but you know your body better than anyone.
Exactly. And the more open the communication is, the better the outcome is likely to be.
One thing I always get tripped up on is how to phrase questions in a way that makes me sound well-informed.
That's a common concern. But remember, doctors don't expect you to be a medical expert.
Okay, that's good to know.
They want you to ask questions. It shows you're engaged and taking your health seriously.
So instead of just pretending I understand, I should just be honest and say, can you explain that in simpler terms?
Exactly. And don't hesitate to ask those clarifying questions, even if they seem simple.
Like, should I take this medication with food? Or what happens if I miss a dose?
Precisely.
Yeah.
Those little details can make a big difference.
And our sources even provided an example dialogue where the patient asks about those things.
It's really helpful to see how those questions can be phrased.
And it also shows how being assertive can actually lead to better care.
You're not just passively following instructions, you're actively participating in your treatment.
Which brings us back to that idea that it's not just about speaking English, it's about communicating effectively.
Both speaking and listening, asking questions, and making sure we truly understand.
And those skills are important for everyone.
Absolutely. Now, going back to that analogy of doctors being like detectives.
Right. Piecing together clues.
Asking questions is like handing them more pieces of the puzzle.
The more pieces they have, the clearer the picture becomes.
Exactly. Now let's talk about a different kind of situation, emergencies.
Okay, because those are high-stakes moments where clear communication is absolutely crucial.
Our sources stress the importance of being direct and concise in emergencies.
No time for small talk.
Forget about being eloquent. Just get the message across quickly and effectively.
So instead of saying, I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable in my chest, you'd say, severe chest pain.
Exactly. And instead of saying, I'm feeling a little lightheaded, you'd say, I feel like I'm going to faint.
Straight to the point.
And don't forget to provide key details like when the symptoms started, if you've taken any medication, or if you have any allergies.
Every bit of information helps.
It's like giving the medical team a head start.
Our sources had a really good example of someone experiencing sudden chest pain.
What did they say?
They said, sharp chest pain, trouble breathing. It started about 15 minutes ago.
Perfect. No wasted words, just the essential information.
And the sources also mentioned the importance of how we say things in emergencies.
Right. Tone of voice and speed can convey urgency.
In English-speaking cultures, there's a big emphasis on directness in those situations.
So no beating around the bush, just get straight to the point.
Got it. And of course, staying calm is crucial.
Absolutely. Panic can make it much harder to think clearly and communicate effectively.
Deep breaths, right?
Exactly. Okay, let's take a step back from those intense situations for a moment and think about everything we've discussed so far.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've talked about vocabulary, clarifying questions, advocating for ourselves, and communicating in emergencies.
It's like we've built a communication toolbox for healthcare,
And the best part is these tools are useful for everyone.
not just English language learners.
Exactly. Clear communication is a universal need.
So knowing all this, how can we approach our next doctor's visit differently?
That's the million-dollar question. Maybe it's as simple as jotting down our symptoms or practicing some key phrases.
Or maybe it's about being more assertive in asking for clarification or making sure we understand the instructions.
Whatever it is, I encourage you to try something new, because even a small change can make a big difference.
It's about bridging the gap between what we're feeling and what the doctor needs to know.
And language is the bridge that connects those two shores.
Speaking of bridges, let's shift gears and talk about the cultural bridge.
Ah, yes. How cultural differences can impact communication with doctors.
This is fascinating. Tell me more.
Our sources point out that many English-speaking cultures value directness and efficiency in communication.
Especially in medical settings.
Exactly. It's about conveying information clearly and concisely without being too indirect.
I can see how that could be challenging for people from cultures where communication is more nuanced or subtle.
It's important to be aware of those differences so we can adjust our communication style accordingly.
For example, if someone is used to downplaying their pain, they might need to be more explicit with their doctor.
So the doctor understands the severity of the situation.
It's about finding that balance between respecting cultural norms and making sure our needs are met.
Our sources offer some tips for navigating these cultural differences.
Oh, I'd love to hear them.
They suggest being upfront about any language barriers and asking for clarification if we don't understand something.
That's always a good idea.
They also encourage patients to be assertive but respectful in expressing their needs and concerns.
Finding that sweet spot between directness and politeness.
Exactly. And they highlight the importance of active listening, paying attention to both the words and the nonverbal cues.
Because sometimes what's not said is just as important as what is said.
Right. We want to be attuned to the doctor's tone of voice, facial expressions, and body language.
It's like we're cultural detectives looking for clues.
Now let's talk about another challenge, decoding medical terminology.
Oof, those long words can be so intimidating.
But don't worry, our sources have some tips for tackling medical jargon.
I'm all ears.
They recommend keeping a medical glossary handy, either a book or an app.
That's a smart idea.
They also suggest breaking down long words into smaller parts.
Like electrocardiogram becomes electrocardiogram.
Exactly. And sometimes knowing the root of the word can help us figure out its meaning.
And of course, it's always okay to ask the doctor to explain any terms we don't understand.
There's no shame in admitting we need clarification.
Doctors are used to explaining things in simple terms.
They want us to understand what's going on.
Now, what about situations where we need an interpreter?
That's an essential part of ensuring clear communication for patients who don't speak English fluently.
Our sources provide some great advice on how to handle those situations.
They recommend requesting an interpreter in advance if possible.
So the clinic can arrange for one to be there.
Exactly. It's much easier than trying to find one on the spot. They also stress the importance of confirming that the interpreter is qualified and experienced in medical interpreting.
Medical terminology can be very specific.
We want to make sure nothing gets lost in translation.
And they suggest preparing for the appointment by writing down any key questions or concerns.
So you can make sure all your important points are covered.
And during the appointment, they remind us to speak directly to the doctor, not to the interpreter.
The interpreter is there to facilitate the conversation, but the focus should be on the doctor-patient relationship.
Right. It helps maintain that direct connection.
Our sources also highlight the importance of clarifying any cultural nuances that might affect communication.
Like different beliefs about health or illness.
Exactly. It's about bridging that cultural gap to ensure everyone is on the same page. And finally, they encourage patients to ask for a summary at the end of the conversation.
To make sure they understand everything that was discussed.
It's a good way to reinforce the key takeaways and avoid any misunderstandings.
It's amazing how much goes into effective communication in healthcare.
It's a complex interplay of language, culture, and medical knowledge.
But when it works well, it can have a really positive impact on our health.
So let's do a quick recap of all the wisdom we've gathered today.
Okay, fire away.
We've talked about the importance of clear and concise communication, being assertive and asking questions, and understanding medical terminology.
We've explored strategies for navigating cultural differences and the role of interpreters.
And we've emphasized the power of active listening and being engaged in our healthcare.
It's like we've created a roadmap for better communication with doctors.
And this roadmap is for everyone, not just English language learners.
Absolutely. Clear communication is a universal skill.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have a question for our listeners.
Hit me with it.
Think about your next doctor's visit. What's one small change you can make to communicate more clearly and confidently? That's a great question to ponder. Maybe it's writing down your symptoms, practicing some key phrases, or being more assertive in asking for clarification.
Whatever it is, I encourage you to give it a try.
Yeah.
You might be surprised by the difference it makes.
It's really amazing how much of a difference clear communication can make in our healthcare.
It's like we've been given this secret weapon.
And it's a weapon that's available to everyone, regardless of language or cultural background.
That's what I find so empowering about it.
It's about connecting with our doctors on a human level and making sure our voices are heard.
You know, it's interesting how we often think about communication as something we do with others,
Yeah.
but it's also something we do with ourselves.
Oh, that's a great point. Being able to understand and articulate what we're feeling is so important.
Especially when it comes to our health.
It's about taking ownership of our health journey and being an active participant.
And that's what I love about what we've been talking about today. It's not just about learning English vocabulary. It's about giving ourselves the tools to advocate for our own well-being.
It's about bridging that gap between what we're experiencing and what our doctor needs to know to help us.
And language is the bridge that connects those two worlds.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to think about.
I'm ready. What is it?
Think about your next doctor's visit. What's one small change you can make to communicate more clearly and confidently?
It could be something as simple as writing down your symptoms beforehand so you don't forget anything.
Or maybe it's practicing those key phrases for asking questions and seeking clarification.
Or even just taking a deep breath and reminding yourself that you have a right to be an active participant in your healthcare.
Whatever that small change is, I encourage you to embrace it and see what a difference it makes.
Because clear communication isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process.
It's a skill we can keep developing and refining throughout our lives.
So keep practicing, keep learning, and keep using your voice to advocate for your health.
Because when we communicate clearly, we unlock the power to take control of our well-being and create a brighter future for ourselves.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
And to all our listeners out there, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay empowered.